the last of 5 readings from John chapter 6, beginning at verse 56. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and they died, but the one who eats this bread will live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones that did not believe and who was the one that would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." Traumas can affect us, make us think differently, behave differently, reorder our values. On this day, 6 years ago, those of us who were serving or were in churches in the Seashore District gathered at St. Paul in Ocean Springs to remember the 10th anniversary of Katrina. Bishop Ward came, and those of us who had been through it, we were actually living in Petal at the time of Katrina, but it affected us. I was serving 2 churches in Jones County, and Jones County had the largest dollar amount of damage from Katrina outside the 6 coastal counties. Most of the dollar amount damage was to trees, but they were trees that people were expecting to cut and get income from. So it was still damage, and it affected us weeks and weeks without electricity and without school. Someone who was 7 at the time of Katrina said when she was 16, "Are we ever going to stop having to remember Katrina?" We still remember it. It reordered our understandings. It reordered our behavior even. Within just a few years, almost everybody who in the United Methodist system who had been serving as pastors in the Seashore District had moved elsewhere, had gone to other churches because the trauma was so deep. There were churches that closed because so many of their members had left the coast. And others were affected in other ways. Traumas reorder things. 5 years ago today, we got Lynette's cancer diagnosis that reordered our lives. It changed nearly everything about our lives and our expectations. It still has an effect 5 years later. Traumas have that effect. And some people may decide, I don't want to put up with this anymore. Maybe things weren't so great before, but now I'm no longer willing to put up with what I once put up with. John chapter 6 begins with Jesus feeding hungry people. But immediately what he's doing is misunderstood because they want to take him and make him king, which means they want to put him at the head of a violent revolt against the Romans. And Jesus says, this is not what I'm about. And he begins talking about bread and talks about bread. And I always wonder, can I talk about bread for 5 weeks? But he keeps moving it on. We got look at it from different angles because he's trying to get across something. And for a while, we may think these people just don't understand what he's talking about. He's talking about eating flesh and drinking blood. Is he talking about cannibalism? But maybe, and I think here is the point where I think the people who were listening understood what he was saying perfectly well. He was saying there's a trauma coming. It's Passover when this happens. And anything that happens on Passover in the Gospel of John has to do with the death of Jesus. They're hearing him talk about flesh and blood, and they come to understand he's talking about crucifixion. He's talking about trauma. We can't accept this. This is not what we thought we signed up for. I am not going to live with this anymore, with this kind of trauma. And he doesn't go after them. He understands that they understand. And he is not going to change his plan. People begin to leave when he's talking about going through trauma. Not just the casual listeners, but people who've been with him. They hear the teaching perfectly well and they say, this isn't what we want. We're not putting up with this. And he doesn't renegotiate. He says, so be it. And he looks at the 12. And he says, what about you? And Peter says, you know, I don't like this either. This talk about you dying, this talk about your crucifixion, I don't like this either. We don't like this either. We hear what you're saying perfectly well and we understand. But to whom shall we go? You have the words of life. We come to a decision. What are we going to do? How are we going to change? What's going to be different? It will have effects that last for years. When Jesus is talking about his death, he's talking about something that will have effects that last for millennia. To whom shall we go? You know, other folks are leaving. Other folks don't want to hear this. Other folks don't want to go through it. Other folks are finding some way other than trauma to live their lives if they can manage it. But you know what? We think we'll stay. We think we'll stay.